And it doesn't have to be about Empire Strikes Back. You have an opportunity to ask about the model shop at ILM.
Hey guys, just want to say I got taken to see Empire Strikes Back when I was a kid, and my favorite scene was the walkers, because we sat on the side of the stage, and from my angle it felt from like I was in a snowspeeder, so it was kind of cool. But I just want to ask, do you guys lament the fact that there's so much CGI these days, and this is kind of a, I hate to say it, a lost art? I know it's still in use, but like stop motion and stuff like that is, do you feel it's kind of losing its place?
Well, I find CG really an amazing technology. As an individual artist, which stop motion kind of comes down between you, the puppet, and the director. And there is something personally for me that is, it's the spawn of Melissa O'Brien and Ray Harryhausen. You had the capacity to design, build, and create the character. And George gave us enormous freedom to take that once we had the basic concept. And the CG process, from my limited involvement with it, while I think can be a miraculous system, like any artistic tool, or any tool, it's only the people who wield it that define its quality. And for me, the level of personal involvement, because it is so densely technical, for me, you need a gigantic conveyor belt, and everything is brought down into cogs. And just as a person experienced in stop motion versus a little bit I've tinkered with CG, it diminishes my sense of personal involvement, which is one of the gratifications. Yeah, you do it to pay your mortgage. Yeah, you do it because it's a swell thing to do and people would love to be able to do what you do. But the sense of personal satisfaction in the CG conveyor belt, because it has to be broken down into units, is not quite the same thing. And there also tends to be, in my observation, and that's all, I don't know that I'd say this is true, it's just true from my observation, that because of the technology can do anything, there's too much reliance on imitation of technology. And as Dennis is brilliant at observation of reality, Dennis Muren, thank you. There is a quote, and I think it's of Da Vinci's, that nature is the master teacher. And what has happened through the propagation of CG is that too often you are looking at an imitation of nature and using that as a guide for an imitation of an imitation, which innately to me is a devaluation of that. Now that's not a hard and fast rule. I'm just looking at the body of work, and some of it is like, wow, just brilliant. But again, it's the individuals who are manipulating this. And there's too often a sense of focus on the minutia. That's the other thing that my impression of folks that are interested in CG, the reference not only is other movies made with CG, but there's a sense of, I don't know what the right way to put this is, there is more interest in the technology than the film. That there is a syntax to film, and it's a big canvas and a huge vocabulary in filmmaking. But there's an old axiom, if the only tool you got is a hammer, no matter how sophisticated, every problem looks like a nail. And life ain't like that. And I just saw recently The Searchers, which is a beautiful John Ford film. If you have never seen it, go see it. And one of the things he liked to do with his actors is put them out there, see what they're going to do, and not make everything perfect. He would look for accidents, because those are the sparks. You have an actor that muffs a line, but it sounds right. It gives the other actor, if they're on their toes, a spontaneity that you can't rehearse. And there is an axiom a friend of mine came up with about the downside potential for CG, and you can perfect something to failure. It's perfect, but it's not real or swell. But like I say, I don't want to sound too negative about it, but it is an absolutely terrific system and allows you to do almost anything, limited by your imagination.
You know, also, but also on the Star Wars series, all 6 films, I mentioned earlier there were 7 model makers on Star Wars. By the time you reach Sith, there were almost 100, and each time it took about a year and a half, not quite 2 years, to do each of the films. It's just that there was so much more stuff in Jedi, and the problem, sometimes the problem for me is like, you know, if you can move the wallpaper, why do it? You know, why animate the wallpaper in the background? And sometimes that's the progression. It's like if you could do it, they did it, and there's traffic outside every window all the time. You know, was it really necessary?
Thank you, guys.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hello, I was wondering, when you were, say, in high school or younger, were you interested in model making as a hobby? Or in other words, where did you learn your skills for modeling?
You know, I'd say I was no more or less interested in model making than any other kid. You know, there were pirate movies at one time, and I made pirate ships with weights, so I could put them in the bathtub. I modified little cars. I, played with tanks and things like that. But not to any great extent. But I was felt I was born and bred some variation on an artist. You know, maybe a capital A, not a capital A, but a medium-sized A or lowercase a, somewhere in there. But anything that had to do with aesthetics, my dad had a shop and in the garage, and I built my own furniture. I think when I was in junior high school, that kind of thing. So, but I didn't necessarily stay with the furniture thing. I jumped to something else and jumped to something else. And I personally just really lucked out. Somebody I went to college with, I came face to face walking on this lot, and he said, we're making a science fiction film out in the valley called Star Wars. Do you think you can help out? We're having a really hard time finding people to work on it, that are skilled model makers. And I said, yeah, maybe. Let me go out and see, But if that hadn't happened, I wouldn't have, and at the time, me personally, I think I read 5 science fiction books in my life, even now, and they were the Dune series when I was in college. And I wasn't particularly interested in science fiction either, but the process and the quality of the things that we were doing. When I arrived, there were maybe 4 model makers or something like that, but I could just see that the stuff that they were doing was really neat. And the drawings that the art director had done was like, even though I thought, well, it's a science fiction film, what's that going to be like? I thought, God, this is really neat work anyway, and embarked upon it. But it was anything that was aesthetics or what it appealed to me, and design and creation, that kind of thing. But I don't, and also I'm not necessarily the best model maker in the world. Every once in a while get someone face to face who's like, you're the best model maker in the world. And I've met a couple of people on the outside who I think, ooh, those people are, but they aren't necessarily, like I said, it's not just model making, it's all these problem solving, how to make something break really easy like pasta rather than a boomerang, that kind of thing, and what the structure of that wood is that you modify that with bleach, that makes the wood weaker than it is when it isn't bleached overnight, that kind of thing. So that's all kinds of things other than just laying the plastic and gluing it down. Okay. Thanks.
How about yourself, John? Your background that getting into model making?
Well, when I was a kid, one of my main drivers has always been animation. When I was a kid, I loved the Disney work and Warner Brothers cartoons, and was really intrigued with that until I found something called George Pal Puppetoons. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with that, but George Pal, aside from doing very early Lucas-type movies, did these little animated short subjects for theater distribution. And I thought, what the heck? Those ones, they have real shadows. They're not a cartoon. What is that? And that kind of led me into studying sculpture and a number of different things. And I tried, like Lauren, making model tanks and model cars when I was a kid, generally with unsatisfactory results. But as I understood more of what Willis O'Brien and Ray Harryhausen were doing, and it tied into that same kind of thing. It opened up a whole vista, not just of animation, but just how do you make an environment? How do you make a tree? How do you make a natural environment, or buildings, architectural? And like a lot of the folks like Phil Tippett and Dennis and Ken Ralston, we all tinkered around individually on our own in our parents' garages, experimenting, until I got a job doing TV commercials where I got that skill developed further and further, and then that got built on it.
And Pillsbury Doughboy?
Yes, sir. Among others. And so it developed and evolved, driven by an interest to replicate some of the things I'd seen in movies.
Did you guys have anything to do with Disney parks and the big malls and the landscaping and all that?
Not I.
At the Disney park?
Yeah, I believe the Orlando has the full size, or close to full size.
Yes, no, those were done, I'm sure they had a whole group of, especially that walker is incredible. They had welders, they had, you know, they took the designs, of course, from Star Wars, but it was constructed here in Florida, I'm sure, with Disney people.
Thank you.
Mr. Peterson, Mr. Burke, thank you both for being here. Whose idea was it originally to bash the World War II model kits in the original Star Wars?
You know, I think it happened prior to when we started. It was just a thing that people did, you know. I mean, when I was a kid, you bought this kind of car, and then you bought the other little model car, and you used the fenders off of that one to, you know, add and make it a super duper hot rod on this one. Even the word kit bashing, I think, existed prior to when we were doing Star Wars. Everybody knows that we would take in the warehouse where the models came from, we'd take 2 shopping carts and go in there, and then we just pull off the shelves and fill the shopping cart completely up and go to the front, and they'd add it up. And we'd have, you know, in some of the photographs you can see racks of them. I figured it was $1,500 worth of models per rack, and now it would be, you know, it would be like $4,000 worth of model kits per rack, but we would just pull them off the shelves and gobble them up all the time. But I think it existed prior to, I'm sure it did exist prior to when we were doing that. Oh, you know what, even 2001 used model kit parts when it was done, and that was done in 69, around that?
67, 60.
What's that?
It was in production around 67, 66, 67, released in 68.
But you know, we would look at that footage slowly, and one of the things we noticed was that there wasn't an interconnectedness. I don't know if there's a real word there, but you know, that this pipe and tube would just terminate nowhere. And so we thought, you know, what we need to do, it needs to go to a plenum box, and then it needs to go over to the equivalent of a carburetor, and then it needs to, you know, so that no matter how closely you looked at it, it still seemed logical that led over to this engine and this over here. Because when you do slow, even the 2001 was wonderful, when you slowed it down and looked at it, those tubes and pipes and things were much more arbitrary. They were rectilinear, of course, and laid down in a grid, but they didn't, like the Millennium Falcon, you could sit there and look at the real thing, you know, from 2 feet away in a museum, and you know, just ponder it. You don't see that kind of missing link. And but yeah, 2001 used kits too.
And one other thing, just to put it a little bigger perspective, kit bashing is impossible without the kits. And if you look at the evolution of commercial model kits, up until like 1950, late 40s, early 50s, styrene was a brand new thing. Kits made in the 40s, particularly with the war effort and all that stuff, were usually wood with some very primitive plastic pieces in there. So you look at movies out of the 40s and the 30s, a lot of that stuff was generated right in the model shops that they would have in the studios, which means they take wood, they'd have a blueprint, and they'd carve and fabricate everything right from scratch. But as movies got, or as model kits became more in the plastic, which is extremely facile material to work with, you can see that thing developing in a lot of the movies coming out of the 50s, where anything that could save some time and fabrications of everything right from scratch is a real boon. But that wasn't available until the plastic industry really got cooking.